The Forgotten and I spent the next few years together off and on. He spent a great deal of that time obsessing over every minute detail of the ritual he was preparing. Occasionally he would ask me to cast a certain protection or reinforcement spell here or there while he closely observed. Whenever I did so, he was disgusted by my display of ignorance and would subsequently fling a book in my direction. For a long time, he didn't teach me anything directly, but through his books, I finally began to understand something about the basics of magic. The materials, words, and the intricate gestures performed were important components of the spell, but these things were generally used to assist the caster. They hold no power in and of themselves. That is, they help the caster focus his mind, connect to the power of the natural world, and bend it to his will. This explains how two casters trying to produce the same effect may use entirely different words or components. Of course, Anazal didn't supply this knowledge to me for no reason. He needed me. He couldn't perform this ritual himself. For it to work, I would also have to do a part of it, and after witnessing my ineptitude, he couldn't count on me to do so correctly. However, he was busy himself constructing the ritual, and apparently a dedicated space from which to perform it. So for a while at least, the books were all I had. He had started construction on Algaroth of a pyramid structure similar to the ones you might know from Egypt, but nothing quite that large was necessary. Inside there was a central chamber with a sort of altar directly beneath the zenith of the pyramid. The room was intricately carved with runes in a similar fashion to those on his cave walls, etched out of the stone, filled with silver, then punctuated in places by sparkling inset gemstones. It was quite a spectacle to behold, but it hadn't been done for decoration. Each rune, every stone, had a specific purpose, and their arrangement had been meticulously laid out. When the pyramid was completed, the ritual was ready, but despite his impatience to have it done, he wanted to wait for the coming summer solstice. Anazal reasoned that Aina would be her weakest on the longest day of the year. Until then, he still wasn't confident that I was ready to perform it. I may have felt like I would become a much better spellcaster through his books, but he still scoffed at everything I thought I knew and began to build me like he'd built the pyramid. He was relentless in his instruction, pouring on new spells, words of power, and concepts every day. He just expected me to master them all as quickly as he presented them. He was furious whenever I didn't. We had a schedule to keep and no time to waste reteaching something he thought I should have already mastered. I didn't understand the need to rush. We were both undead after all. If we missed the summer solstice, there would always be another next year, and the year after, and so on. When you have an eternity, what's the difference between 1 year and 10? I'd have dedicated centuries to the cause if that's what it took, but he clearly had other plans. Not the mentor I'd have chosen for you, though I must admit you have grown stronger, my dear. As usual, Aina popped up at random times and places to remind me that she was still there. Now she was lounging lazily on the sofa in the corner of my office while I discharged some of my regular duties. But you don't really trust that old bag of bones, do you? Not entirely, no, I answered calmly, but more than you. Oh, she moaned, feigning emotional interest. You wound me, dearest. I'm sure you'll get over it. After all I've done for you, she began her usual appeal. For yourself, I corrected. That charade is over. Let's stop pretending it was ever about me, shall we? We both know the truth. Oh, pooh, she dismissed my point. I gave you everything you asked for, but when I asked for one tiny little thing in return... Save it, I cut her off. Your guilt trips don't work either. I'd heard the speech dozens of times by now. The words changed a little here and there, but it was always the same approach. Woe is me, you're a heartless ingrate, etc. Guilt trips are an effective tactic on people who care, but I didn't. And the truth, she asked with a grin. Because you know all about that, I mocked sarcastically. You can't deceive if you don't know the truth, she answered casually. It was a good point, and part of what makes her so dangerous. If someone always lies, then at the very least you learn what is not true when they tell you something. But she wasn't so predictable. Sometimes she will tell you the truth. You just never know which one you're getting. He means to destroy you, she offered. Good, I answered without looking up from my papers. I had already considered that as a possibility and accepted the risk. In fact, if this didn't work, my next trip was to Legala. If anyone on this planet knew magic powerful enough to destroy me, I reasoned it would be the elves. I don't know what awaits me in the abyss, but I know she isn't there. And if I can't be rid of her here, then I will be rid of her there. Am I really so bad, she asked. All I want is the best for you, my love. Ha! I scoffed. You never have and never will. Go away, I'm busy. Very well. You're free to choose your own path, but don't say I didn't warn you. For the record, I hate when she says that, because as you can see from this exchange, she really hasn't warned me at all. Your choice will have some unmentioned, non-specific consequences isn't exactly a warning. It's just stating the obvious. Every choice has consequences. Her insinuation that these consequences might be bad was also meaningless. Bad for her wasn't necessarily bad for me. As I've said, even if this ritual had destroyed me, it was a price I was willing to pay. When the summer solstice finally arrived, the Forgotten wanted to perform the ritual during the day to increase the likelihood of success. He reasoned, of course, that Aina was at her weakest when Iplios was high in the sky. However, my limitations made that impossible to do. While the sunlight had not destroyed me before, a pile of ash cannot recite a spell either. So he chose to perform the ritual as close to the hazy moments just before dawn as we could, so that Aina's power would be fading as Iplios regained his. When I awoke that evening and ascended to my office, she was there waiting, sprawled out lazily on the couch, staring back at me as I entered the room with a little sparkle in her dark eyes. Do you know what this ritual will do? She asked. Rid me of you, I answered flatly as I once again shuffled and signed the various papers left for me. I have already told you, my dear, there is nowhere beyond me, she purred at me. We shall see. When I had finished my work and prepared to step through the shadows to Algaroth, she hit me once again with a vague warning. If you persist in casting this spell he's created, don't blame me for its effects. Initially, I pushed aside her warning as meaningless and passed through the darkness into the pyramid on Algaroth, where I found an impatient Anazal already standing in his appointed place, ready to begin. But as I took my own place opposite him, I hesitated. The time is now, the Forgotten told me. Begin as I've instructed and enunciate each syllable clearly. I did as he instructed, but in my mind there was a grain of doubt. Don't blame me for the effects, she had said. Did she already know what the effects would be? How could she? The spell had never been cast before. It was an entirely new creation. As far as I knew, no one had ever even attempted to do what we were about to try. Hans potentiam a me, I recited absently while my mind continued to mull her meaning. She was a goddess, of course. She is everywhere. It is not just possible, but is very likely that she had seen the entire ritual as the Forgotten had created it, and she would be able to predict its outcome. Gods in Etia are not quite the all-knowing entities your religions proclaim your one god to be, and magic is, of course, mysterious even to its practitioners. But how mysterious can it really be to an entity that had existed before magic itself? One who had been intricately connected to the very creation of it. Relinquia disparagat, I continued. Don't blame me, though. I knew then that this ritual would not destroy me, as she had hinted at before. If I were destroyed, I couldn't very well blame anyone at all, could I? But something else crept into my mind as well. Temporis at spati, I finished. She didn't really try to stop me, did she? A half-hearted attempt to convince me, perhaps, but nothing more than that. She could have, of course. I have no doubt she could have if she'd chosen to. The only logical reason she hadn't, she knew it wouldn't work. When the Forgotten had completed his portion, and the echoes of his final syllable had finally vibrated through the runes, there was a calm, almost deafening silence, where nothing at all seemed to happen. And then, slowly at first, a force began to swirl within the chamber. Around and around it whirled, gaining speed, and now volume, as it became a barely contained cyclone within the walls of the pyramid. What had begun as a low monotone rose in both decibel and pitch, until it was both deafening and maddening. A fog began to creep out of the floor beneath us, and was quickly picked up within the whirlwind, until the entire chamber was obscured, and we could see nothing but each other standing in the center of a screaming tornado. I looked over to the Forgotten, not entirely sure whether any of this was expected result or if something had gone wrong. As usual, his expression was entirely unreadable, but he stood there motionless with his palms calmly held out in front of him, as though he were expecting to be handed something, and for a few moments I was reassured that everything was going fine. Fine, that is, until I began to feel a pull. Like everything else, the sensation was faint at first, but steadily grew stronger and stronger. It was pulling me upward, and before long I found myself lifted off the ground. Only a few inches at first, but the pull continued to grow, and I felt myself rising faster and faster through the center of the swirling cyclone. I glanced over to see if the Forgotten was there too, but he was not. He was still there below me, firmly planted on the ground with his palms out before him. I could not see the roof of the pyramid. The whole structure above me was obscured by the dark swirling clouds as I continued to rise further and faster. The pyramid was not particularly tall, and at this rate I should have crashed into its zenith in a few seconds. But I was still rising faster and faster, never reaching the swirling clouds or the roof I assumed was beyond them. I could no longer see the Forgotten below me. Everything in every direction was now moving so fast that nothing had any distinction. It was all just an amorphous gray blur, accompanied by a monotone roar and an endless upward motion that carried on for either an eternity or a mere moment. I had no idea. Time itself meant nothing in this gray, empty mass of nothingness, for I had no way in which to gauge it, and the sensory deprivation was driving me insane. Finally, through the endless roar came a familiar and unwelcome sound. I closed my eyes and sighed with frustration. It hadn't worked. She was still with me. Geht es Ihnen gut, mein Herr? Surprisingly, when I opened my eyes again but a moment later, I was not in the endless gray nothing, but standing on a small dirt road in the middle of a forest I didn't recognize. I could tell by the slowly fading blue in the sky that it was just after dusk, but I had no idea where I was. Standing in front of me were two middle-aged men dressed strangely but simply. With sun-worn complexions and an overall dirty appearance, I assumed they were farmers. "I'm afraid I'm rather lost, my good man. I'm sure I can find my way, if you would be so kind to inform me where I am," I said with a smile and trying to be as friendly as possible. "Was? Ich verstehe nicht," one of them answered. They both looked at each other, then back to me with a puzzled stare. The distant howl of a lone wolf seemed to frighten them. As soon as we'd heard it, they were in a great rush to be gone. "Wir müssen gehen. Entschuldigung." They repeated that last word a couple times as they hurriedly and cautiously moved past me down the road toward a few small lights in the distance at a rather brisk pace. Standing there, entirely disoriented and not just a little confused, I heard that laugh once again. Spinning around to look, there she was, perched atop a large boulder alongside the road. "I did warn you, my sweet," she said with mock concern. "What have you done?" I asked. "Where am I?" "Oh, now, I told you. I have done nothing. You have chosen this yourself," she began to lecture me. "This is not my doing, but your own." "Uh-huh," I answered doubtfully. "It may have appeared to be my choice, but I was sure she'd done something. Question was, what exactly had she done? Where are we? I don't recognize this place." "You wouldn't," she answered curtly. "You've never been here." Apparently, she wasn't going to be volunteering much information. "Fascinating," I replied. "I'm sure you've brought me here for a good reason, but whatever it is, I'm afraid you'll have to do it without me. I have more pressing matters to attend to," I said as I prepared to shadow walk back to Calbourne Castle. To my surprise, when I stepped into the shadow of the boulder, I did not transport to Calbourne, but walked rather abruptly, face first, into the rock. "Welcome to Earth," she said with a giggle, before fading out of sight.